Welcome to the deep dive from Safety One Source. Today we're really going deep on something super important for anyone involved in construction and workplace safety. OSHA's 1926 Subpart P, all about excavations.
Yeah.
I know regulations can be a little dry sometimes.
Right.
But trust me, this deep dive is going to be anything but boring. We're going to uncover some really surprising stuff, some real-world implications.
For sure.
And maybe even a few ha-ha moments along the way.
You're absolutely right. Excavations might seem pretty straightforward at first glance, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And the consequences of getting it wrong can be severe.
Absolutely.
OSHA has put so much emphasis on Subpart P to make sure everyone understands the hazards and how to mitigate them.
Okay, so let's start with the basics.
Sure.
What exactly does Subpart P cover?
Yeah.
Is it just those massive construction excavations? Or are we talking about smaller scale digs too?
It's broader than a lot of people realize, actually. Subpart P applies to any man-made cut cavity trench or depression in the Earth's surface formed by removing earth.
Wow.
That means even something as seemingly simple as digging a hole for a fence post falls under this regulation.
So that's a much wider scope than I initially imagined.
Yeah.
Makes sense, though. I guess anytime you're disturbing the earth, there's a potential for things to go wrong.
Absolutely.
Why is OSHA so focused on excavations in particular?
Well, think about the forces at play.
Yeah.
We're talking about tons of soil and rock.
Yeah.
And those forces can be unpredictable.
Right.
One small mistake, like underestimating soil stability or failing to properly shore a trench,
Right.
can lead to a catastrophic cave-in. And sadly, those incidents can be fatal. Subpart P is all about preventing those tragedies.
Okay, so that definitely puts things into perspective. So where do we even begin with such a comprehensive regulation? There must be a ton of information to unpack.
A good place to start is with the scope and definitions laid out in section 1926.650. This clarifies what types of excavations fall under Subpart P and introduces crucial terms that we'll need to understand the rest of the standard.
Sounds like a solid foundation.
Yeah.
Now, as I was going through the standard, I kept coming across this term, competent person. It seems like this individual plays a pretty critical role in excavation safety.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. A competent person is more than just someone who's read the OSHA manual.
Right.
They need to be able to identify existing and predictable hazards in the excavation and the surrounding work environment. But more importantly, they have the authority to take prompt corrective measures to eliminate those hazards.
So we're not just talking about theoretical knowledge here.
No.
This person needs to be able to assess the situation in real time.
Yeah.
And take action if they see something unsafe. That's a lot of responsibility.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where a competent person notices cracks forming along the wall of an excavation. They need to know what those cracks mean, how to assess the risk of a cave-in, and have the authority to stop work immediately if necessary. Their decisions can literally be the difference between life and death.
Wow.
Yeah.
That makes their role incredibly important. Now, Subpart P also talks a lot about protecting workers from hazards related to underground installations. Why is that such a big deal?
You're referring to section 1926.651B, right?
Yeah.
It's a critical part of the standard because hitting an underground utility line during excavation can be disastrous.
Yeah.
We're talking gas explosions, electrocutions, disrupted services, a whole cascade of potential problems.
It reminds me of a story I heard actually about a crew that was digging a trench for a new water line.
Okay, yeah.
They didn't properly locate the existing gas main and ended up puncturing it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it caused a massive explosion and delayed the project for months.
Wow.
Not to mention the safety risks involved.
Yeah, that's a perfect illustration of why this section is so important. Before you even think about putting a shovel in the ground, you need to determine the estimated location of all underground installations. Sewer lines, cables, fuel lines, you name it. And it's not enough to just guesstimate.
Right.
You have to contact the utility companies to get accurate location markings.
So no digging blind. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But what if those utility companies can't get out there to mark the lines right away?
Yeah.
Does everything just grind to a halt?
Not necessarily. The standard does allow for some flexibility. If a utility company can't respond within 24 hours or longer, if required by state or local law, the employer can proceed cautiously.
Okay.
But they absolutely must use detection equipment or other acceptable means to locate those underground installations. It's all about minimizing risk.
So even when time is tight, there's no excuse for cutting corners. Safety always comes first.
For sure.
Now, besides those underground hazards, Subpart P also gets into specifics about how workers safely enter an excavations right.
Yes. Section 1926.651C lays out the requirements for access and egress. For excavations 4 feet or more in depth, you need a stairway, ladder ramp, or other safe means of egress. And those egress points can't be spaced too far apart. Workers shouldn't have to travel more than 25 feet laterally to get out.
And I remember reading that even the ramps themselves need to have specific features, like cleats, to prevent slipping.
Yeah.
It seems like OSHA has really thought of everything right down to the smallest details.
Absolutely. These details are designed with worker safety in mind.
Yeah.
Think about it. A worker carrying heavy equipment up a slick ramp
Yeah.
is an accident waiting to happen. Those cleats might seem like a small thing, but they can make a huge difference in preventing falls and injuries.
It's all about creating a safe working environment from the ground up, literally.
Literally.
So far, we've covered competent persons, underground utilities, and access and egress. What other essential elements fall under these general excavation requirements?
Subpart P also covers protection from vehicular traffic. If employees are working near traffic, they need to wear high visibility vests, and the area needs to be clearly marked. There are also requirements for protecting workers from falling loads. If there is a risk of something falling into the excavation, like tools or materials, workers need to be kept clear of the area.
Speaking of protecting workers, Subpart P also addresses hazardous atmospheres, right? After all, you never know what kind of gases or fumes might be lurking down there.
You're right. Section 1926.651G requires employers to ensure that excavations are tested for hazardous atmospheres and that appropriate ventilation is provided if necessary. Think about things like methane gas, carbon monoxide, or even low oxygen levels, all potential hazards that can't be ignored.
It seems like OSHA has really tried to cover all the bases when it comes to excavation safety, but I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here. The real meat of this standard, the part that really gets everyone's attention, is the section on protective systems, right? After all, preventing those catastrophic cave-ins is the ultimate goal here.
You're absolutely right. That's where we'll head next. We'll dive deep into the different types of protective systems and what makes them effective. Looking at sloping, benching, shoring, and shielding the key players in keeping those excavation walls stable.
Okay, get ready to go even deeper as we explore the heart of Subpart P.
Welcome back to the deep dive. As we were discussing before, the real crux of Subpart P lies in the protective systems designed to prevent cave-ins. This is where things get really interesting and where the competent person's expertise becomes absolutely essential.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk about those protective systems. From what I understand, there are 4 main options. Sloping, benching, shoring, and shielding. Can you break down each one for us and explain when they might be appropriate?
Absolutely. Let's start with sloping, which is one of the simplest methods.
Okay.
It involves cutting back the sides of the excavation at an angle to create a slope that's less likely to collapse.
So instead of having straight vertical wall,
Right.
you're essentially creating a gradual ramp out of the soil.
Exactly. And the key here is the angle of that slope.
Okay.
It can't be too steep or you risk a collapse. That's where soil classification comes in. Remember how we talked about the competent person needing to identify hazards?
Right.
Well, this is a perfect example of that in action.
Right. They need to be able to determine what type of soil we're dealing with to figure out how steep that slope can be.
Precisely. Subpart P classifies soil into 3 main types: A, B, and C. Type A is the most stable, like solid rock or compacted clay.
Okay.
Type C is the least stable,
Right.
like loose sand or gravel.
Gotcha.
And Type B falls somewhere in between. Appendices A and B of the standard provide detailed guidelines on how to classify soil and determine the maximum allowable slope for each type.
Okay, I see where this is going. So if we have really stable type A soil, we might be able to get away with a steeper slope
Right.
than if we're dealing with loose, unstable type C soil.
Right. Exactly. For example, with type A soil, you might be able to have a slope of 3/4 horizontal to 1 vertical. But with type C, you'd need a much shallower slope,
Okay.
maybe 1.5 horizontal to 1 vertical,
Gotcha.
to ensure stability. And of course, type B would fall somewhere in the middle.
It's kind of like building a sandcastle.
Yeah.
You can get away with steeper walls if the sand is wet and compacted, but if it's dry and loose, everything just crumbles.
That's a great analogy. And just like with your sandcastle, the competent person needs to use their judgment and experience to assess the soil conditions and determine the appropriate slope angle.
Now, what if sloping alone isn't enough to prevent a cave-in, either because of the soil type or the depth of the excavation? What are our other options?
That's where benching comes in.
Right.
Benching is basically creating a series of steps
Okay.
or horizontal levels in the excavation walls. Each bench acts like a mini slope,
Gotcha.
reducing the overall height of the vertical wall and decreasing the risk of collapse.
So sort of like terracing a hillside to prevent erosion, but on a much smaller scale.
Exactly. And just like with sloping,
Yeah.
the width and height of those benches are dictated by the soil type and the overall depth of the excavation. Appendices A and B of Subpart P provide those specific measurements.
So if we're dealing with that loose, unstable Type C soil, we might need to use narrower benches and more of them to create a stable excavation, right?
That's exactly right. The more unstable the soil, the more support you need to provide.
Okay. Sloping and benching make sense for situations where the soil is relatively stable or the excavation isn't too deep. But what about those really challenging scenarios where the soil is super unstable or we need to dig really deep? What options do we have then?
That's where shoring and shielding come into play. These systems provide more robust support to the excavation walls, essentially creating a temporary structure to hold back the soil and prevent it from collapsing.
Shoring sounds a bit like building a wall within a wall. Am I on the right track?
You're exactly right. Shoring typically involves installing vertical supports called uprights along the excavation walls. These uprights are then braced by horizontal members called wales and cross braces to create a strong and stable framework.
And what are those typically made of? I'm picturing wooden planks, but I bet there are other options too.
You're right, there are different materials that can be used for shoring. The classic method is timber shoring,
Okay.
which uses wooden planks for all the components. It's a tried and true approach, especially for smaller excavations. But for larger or more complex excavations, you often see aluminum hydraulic shoring.
Okay.
This uses pre-engineered aluminum components and hydraulic cylinders to create a more adjustable and efficient system.
Aluminum hydraulic shoring. That sounds pretty high tech.
Yeah.
What are the advantages of using that over the traditional timber shoring?
One of the biggest advantages is versatility. Aluminum hydraulic shoring systems can be easily adjusted to fit different excavation sizes, and they're often much quicker to install than timber systems,
Yeah.
which can save time and money on a project.
But I'm guessing there are some downsides too, right?
Right. Well, one thing to consider is the cost.
Okay.
Aluminum hydraulic shoring systems tend to be more expensive than timber shoring.
Right.
So the decision often comes down to a balancing act, the size and complexity of the excavation.
Right.
The soil conditions, the budget for the project, and the level of risk involved.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It sounds like choosing the right shoring system requires a careful assessment of all those factors. Now, what about shielding? How is that different from shoring?
Shielding involves using prefabricated structures,
Okay.
often called trench boxes or trench shields, to protect workers within the excavation. Imagine it like this. You're essentially creating a protective shell within the excavation itself.
So instead of supporting the walls directly, like with shoring,
Right.
you're providing a barrier to protect workers if a cave-in does occur.
Exactly. The shield is designed to withstand the forces of a cave-in,
Right.
creating a safe zone for workers inside. They're typically made from steel aluminum or a combination of materials.
It sounds like a good option for those really high-risk situations where you need maximum protection.
You're right. Shielding is often used in deeper excavations or when the soil conditions are particularly unstable. And just like with shoring,
Yeah.
the choice of material for the shield depends on the specific conditions of the excavation and the requirements of the project.
So we've got sloping, benching, shoring, and shielding, a whole arsenal of tools to prevent those dreaded cave-ins.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling there's more to Subpart P than just choosing a protective system. What other key safety measures are we overlooking?
You're right, there's more to the story. Subpart P also lays out additional safety measures that go hand in hand with using these protective systems. We need to think about inspections protection from loose rock and soil,
Right.
and addressing potential water accumulation hazards. All crucial elements for a truly safe excavation.
Okay, let's dive into those additional safety measures. What should we know about inspections?
Subpart P is very clear on this. Daily inspections of excavations are non-negotiable. The competent person is responsible for inspecting the excavation itself, the adjacent areas, and the protective systems in place. They need to be on the lookout for any signs of potential cave-ins, like cracks in the soil,
Right.
indications of failure in the protective systems, or the presence of hazardous atmospheres.
Daily inspections. That sounds pretty rigorous.
Yeah.
But I guess it makes sense when you consider how much things can change from one day to the next.
Absolutely.
Well, especially in an excavation.
Exactly. And remember, these inspections aren't just about checking boxes.
Yeah.
They're about actively looking for hazards and taking action to mitigate them. The competent person's judgment and experience are paramount here.
Now, I remember reading in the standard that inspections are also required after rainstorms or any other event that could increase the risk of hazards.
Yeah.
That seems particularly important when you think about how water can impact soil stability.
You've hit on a crucial point. Excavation safety isn't static. It's a dynamic process that requires constant vigilance and adaptation to changing conditions. A heavy rainstorm can completely alter the stability of an excavation.
Right.
So those additional inspections are vital. It's all about staying ahead of the curve and preventing accidents before they happen.
Okay, we've talked about inspections. What about loose rock and soil? I can imagine that being a serious hazard in an excavation.
Yeah.
Especially if a large chunk of material were to break free and fall on someone below.
You're absolutely right. That's why Section 1926.651J specifically addresses protection from loose rock or soil. Employers are required to provide adequate protection from these hazards.
Right.
And that might involve several different approaches.
So what are some of those approaches? What can be done to mitigate those risks?
One common method is scaling,
Okay.
which involves removing loose material from the excavation face.
Yep.
Sort of like knocking off any loose bits that could fall. Another approach is to install protective barricades or nets to stop and contain any falling debris.
So it's not just about relying on the protective system to hold back the soil.
Right.
It's also about actively taking steps to prevent anything from falling in the first place.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered approach to safety. You want to create as many lines of defense as possible to protect workers from those falling hazards.
Speaking of layers, let's not forget about water. Water accumulation in an excavation can create a whole host of problems, from increasing the risk of cave-ins to creating slippery surfaces and potentially hazardous atmospheres.
You're right. Water is definitely something you don't want to mess with in an excavation. And Subpart P addresses those concerns directly in Section 1926.651 error.
Okay.
Employers are required to take precautions to protect workers from water accumulation hazards.
Okay, so what kinds of precautions are we talking about here? How do you actually keep water out of an excavation, especially if you're working in an area with a high water table?
There are a few different approaches.
Okay.
One option is to use special support systems or shields that are designed to withstand water pressure. You can also implement water removal systems like pumps or drains to control the level of accumulated water.
So it's a combination of preventing water from entering in the first place and having systems in place to remove it if it does accumulate.
Precisely. And in some cases, you might even need to provide workers with safety harnesses and lifelines if they're working in wet conditions, just as an added layer of protection.
It sounds like dealing with water in excavations is a whole other level of complexity.
It definitely adds another layer of challenge.
Yeah.
But Subpart P provides the guidance and requirements to manage those risks effectively.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the competent person's role, the importance of locating underground utilities, and the four main types of protective systems. Then we dove into additional safety measures like inspections, protection from loose rock and soil, and managing water accumulation hazards. I feel like we're starting to get a really good grasp of this whole excavation safety.
We've covered a lot of ground, but believe it or not, there are still a few more nuggets of wisdom to unearth from Subpart P.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What else do we need to know to make sure we're operating safely and complying with the standard? Welcome back to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Safety One Source. We're wrapping up our exploration of OSHA 1926 Subpart P, and I have to say, I'm really starting to appreciate the level of detail and thought that's gone into this regulation.
Yeah.
It's clear that OSHA takes excavation safety very seriously.
They absolutely do, and for good reason. As we've seen, excavations present a unique set of hazards.
Yeah.
And Subpart P provides a comprehensive framework for mitigating those risks and protecting workers.
And before we wrap up completely, are there any other essential elements of Subpart P that we haven't touched on yet? Anything we need to know to make sure we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's when it comes to excavation safety?
You're right. There are a few more important points to highlight. For example, Subpart P has specific requirements for the design and construction of support systems, especially when it comes to shoring and shielding. These details are spelled out in Appendices C and D of the standard.
Right.
And they cover things like the spacing of uprights, the size and strength of the materials used, and the proper methods for installation.
Appendices C and D, it seems like this regulation just keeps on giving. But I guess that level of detail is necessary
It is.
to ensure that those support systems are truly effective.
Exactly. We're talking about creating structures that can literally hold back tons of soil and rock.
Yeah.
So there's no room for error. Those appendices provide engineers and contractors with the specific guidance they need to design and build those systems correctly.
It's all about creating a safety net, so to speak, to prevent those catastrophic cave-ins.
Precisely. And remember, even with the best designed support system,
Right.
regular inspections are still crucial. Things can change in an excavation, and those support systems need to be monitored for any signs of damage or weakness.
Okay, so regular inspections, adherence to those detailed design requirements in the appendices. Anything else we need to keep in mind?
Another important aspect is the training of workers. Subpart P emphasizes that all workers involved in excavation activities must be adequately trained to recognize and avoid hazards. That means understanding things like soil classification, the different types of protective systems,
Right.
and emergency procedures in case of a cave-in.
So it's not enough to just have a competent person overseeing the project. Everyone on the site needs to have a basic understanding of the hazards and how to stay safe.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of safety where everyone is aware of the risks and takes responsibility for their own well-being and the well-being of their coworkers.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground here today.
We have.
And I'm walking away with a much deeper understanding of OSHA 1926 Subpart P and the critical role it plays in preventing excavation accidents.
Me too. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners have gained some valuable insights as well.
And to all our listeners out there, remember that this deep dive has just scratched the surface of Subpart P. It's a complex regulation with a lot of nuances.
Definitely.
So I encourage you to read the full text of the standard and seek guidance from qualified safety professionals
Yeah.
if you have any questions or need clarification.
And as a final thought, consider this. Even beyond the specific requirements of Subpart P, what steps can you take to promote a culture of safety around excavations in your own work environment? How can you empower your teams to identify hazards, speak up when they see something unsafe, and take proactive steps to protect themselves and their coworkers?
Those are great questions to reflect on. After all, safety isn't just about following rules. It's about creating a mindset where everyone feels empowered to make safe choices and look out for one another.
Absolutely. It's about taking ownership of safety and making it an integral part of every excavation project.
Well said. A huge thank you to Safety One Source for making this deep dive possible. And to everyone listening, stay safe out there. Remember, when it comes to excavation, safety knowledge is power.